We come now to the 11th lesson in our study of the life of Abraham, and it's entitled The God of the Impossible. Probably all of us, there may be times in our lives when we experience or face a situation that seems absolutely overwhelming and maybe even impossible. In fact, it may be so big that we don't know whether to laugh or to cry over it. Well, that was certainly the case with Abraham and Sarah in our text today, which is in Genesis 18. But before we get to Genesis 18, let me give again a little context to the passage. Remember in chapter 17, we looked at this in our last lesson, that God had established his covenant with Abraham. And now after he had done that, he comes back to Abraham and he revealed to him again that Sarah would bear a child. Look at verses 15 and 16 of chapter 17. God also said to Abraham, "As for Sarah, your wife, you are no longer to call her Sarah. Her name will be Sarah. I will bless her and will surely give you a son by her. I will bless her so that she will be the mother of nations. Kings of people will come from her." Abraham fell face down. He laughed and said to himself, "Will a son be born to a man 100 years old? Will Sarah bear a child at the age of 90? Well, the first thing God does is changes Sarah's name from Sarai to Sarah. The word Sarah in the Hebrew meant princess. Remember, Abraham was told he was going to be the father of many nations. Kings would come from him. Well, Sarah was his princess, and therefore she gets that name. She will be the mother of nations. Kings of people shall come from her. And when Abraham heard this, he fell on his face and he laughed. Now, what kind of a laugh was this? I'm going to suggest we're going to look at Abraham's laugh later. Sarah's going to laugh. Two different laughs. Abraham's laugh was a laugh of joyful acceptance and wonder. Haven't you ever received some really great news and you couldn't help it? You just laughed over it? Well, he fell down and he laughed. And God also revealed to him the name of the child. He said, "This is what I want you to name him. I want you to name him Isaac." The word Isaac means he laughs. I think God was honoring Abraham's response of wonder over his promise to him. And when he broke down and laughed, he says, "Okay, your son's going to be named," he laughs, Isaac. And it was then that God also made it very clear that this covenant that had been made with Abraham was going to continue. Remember, we talked about covenant succession. This covenant is going to move on to Isaac and to Isaac's descendants. You can read that starting in verse 19. "Yes, but your wife Sarah will bear you a son, and you will call him Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant for his descendants after him." And so it became very clear that now the covenant would be passed on from Abraham to Isaac. Isaac through his descendants, covenant succession would take place because this is an everlasting covenant. And after this, Abraham followed God's instructions. You can read the rest of that chapter. But now we get to our text. And when we get to this text, which follows right after these events in chapter 17, God comes back to Abraham. Now, let me remind you something here. Remember that Abraham is called God's friend. 3 times in the Bible, we read that Abraham is the friend of God. 2 Chronicles 20, verse 7, in Isaiah 41:8, in James 2, verse 23. He's called the friend of God. Now, I make this point because I really do believe that this incident that takes place in Genesis 18 is the basis for Abraham being called a friend of God, because Abraham entertained God in an intimate way. Now, let me pick it up and read it to you. the Lord appeared to Abraham near the great trees of Mamre while he was sitting at the entrance to his tent in the heat of the day. Let me stop there just a minute. He was sitting there all alone. You see, I think God came to him at a time when Abraham was very lonely. And you start and think about his losses. Had to leave everything when he left Ur of the Chaldees. He lost his father, Terah. His nephew, Lot, they had separated by this time. And he hadn't had a son yet. Of course, there's Hagar and Ishmael, but that's a very different situation. And I think it was at that point that the Lord came to him. And there were 3 visitors who appeared to him that day. Abraham looked up and saw 3 men standing nearby. When he saw them, he hurried from the entrance of his tent to meet them and bowed low to the ground. Abraham said, "If I found favor in your eyes, my Lord, do not pass your servant by. Let a little water be brought, and then you may all wash your feet and rest under this tree. Let me get you something to eat so you can be refreshed, and then you can go your way, now that you've come to your servant." "Very well," they answered. "Do as you say." So Abraham hurried into the tent of Sarah. "Quick," he said, "get 3 seahs of fine flour and knead it and bake some bread." Then he ran to the herd and selected a choice tender calf and gave it to the servant who hurried to prepare it. He then brought some curds and milk and the calf that had been prepared and set before them. And while they ate, he stood near them under the tree. Now, these 3 visitors appeared to Abraham on that day, and I don't think Abraham understood who they were at this point. But I do believe he saw that there was something about them that caught his attention. Now, we know that one of the visitors was God himself. And in fact, we know that because look at verse 1. The Lord appeared to Abraham. The Lord appeared to Abraham. So one of these had to be the Lord himself. It was Yahweh. Remember our word Yahweh appeared to Abraham. And we're also told later in verses 13 and 17 that it was the Lord who spoke to Abraham. So obviously one of these 3 heavenly visitors was the Lord himself. The other 2 were angels appearing in the form of men. Now we're going to hear more about them later because they will go on to Sodom and execute judgment there and deliver Lot. That's coming down the way here. But here's my point. Abraham showed hospitality to these strangers. He wanted to offer the best to them. He went out and got a choice calf, and he puts on a feast for them, and he entertained them. Well, I can't help but think in sort of an interesting passage in Hebrews chapter 13, verse 2 that says, "Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers. For by this some have entertained angels without knowing it." Now, haven't you always sort of questioned what in the world that verse means? Well, I think this is what it was. I think that the writer to the Hebrews was talking about this incident when Abraham showed hospitality to strangers, and it just so happened that they were angels. Well, as we go on, he showed these hospitality, and these 3 heavenly visitors actually fellowshipped with Abraham. Now, if anything, at least this text shows us that God wants us to have an intimate relationship with him. He wants us to be his friends, and he wants to be a friend to us as well. When I think about a true friendship involves many things. But at least these 3 things. It means companionship, and it means communication, and it means love. That's what friendship is made up of. First of all, God provided companionship to Abraham. As I already told you, I think Abraham was very lonely at this point, and God comes to him in his loneliness. He comes to be with him. I don't think this was a fluke incident that takes place here. God intentionally came to Abraham when he was all alone, sitting out in the heat of the day there, and God comes to have companionship with him. He came to be his friend. Well, not only did he have companionship with Abraham, but he communicated with him. He talked to him. In verse 17, the question is, shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do? And the answer to that was, of course not. And so not only did God tell him about the birth of his son, but he's also going ahead and tell him about Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, I haven't read that. I encourage you to go and read that, because he talked to him. He began to reveal things to Abraham. He talked as a friend with a friend. So it involved companionship, it involved communication, but God also showed love to Abraham. He speaks to us. God always speaks to us at the point of our need, and he shows mercy to us when we're hurting. Abraham may not have had many needs, but I'll tell you, he had a huge need. He had no son. He had no heir. And surely this still grieved him greatly. Well, I think about friendship with God. Do you realize that Jesus calls us to be his friends? In John chapter 15, verses 13 to 15, this is what Jesus said: greater love hath no one than this, that one lay down his life for his friends. And he said, you are my friends if you do what I command you. No longer do I call you slaves, for the slave does not know what his master is doing. But I've called you friends, for all things I have heard from my Father, I have made known to you. Do you realize, you remember that old gospel hymn, what a friend we have in Jesus? Well, look at this. Jesus Christ provides us with eternal companionship. He has said to us, I am with you always to the very end of the age. He said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. He is our companion. He is our friend. And he also communicates to us. Jesus said, all things that I have heard from my Father, I have made known to you. He communicates with us. And what about love? Here it is. Greater love has no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. Well, Jesus demonstrated the ultimate love, didn't he? He laid down his life for us when he went to the cross. Indeed, he is our friend, and there is no greater friend in all of the universe that we could have than to be a friend of Jesus and to know that he is a friend to us. Well, let's pick up at this point. Where was Sarah with all of this? Well, one of the three visitors says, where is your wife? I'm in verse 9. Where is your wife Sarah? They ask him. There in the tent, he said. Then the Lord said, I will surely, remember the Lord, there's Yahweh again, so one of these visitors, I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son, reaffirming what God had already promised. Now Sarah was listening at the entrance to the tent which was behind him. And Abraham and Sarah were already old and well advanced in years, and Sarah was past the age of childbearing. So Sarah laughed to herself as she thought, after I am worn out and my master is old, will I now have this pleasure? And then the Lord, Yahweh, said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh and say, by the way, she laughed to herself, but this is the Lord. He knew exactly what was going on. Then the Lord said, why did Sarah laugh and say, will I really have a child now that I'm old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? Is anything too hard for the Lord? I will return to you at the appointed time next year, and Sarah will have a son. Well, when Sarah heard what God said, what the Lord had said, she laughed. Now, I'm going to suggest her laughter was very different from Abraham. In fact, when the Lord said, why did Sarah laugh? You go on to read the end of this. It said, Sarah was afraid, so she lied and said, I did not laugh. But he said, yes, you did laugh. You see, her laughter was very, very different. Her laughter was not a laughter of joyful acceptance. It was a laughter of unbelief, totally different from that of Abraham. And so God says, why did Sarah laugh? But God knew exactly why she laughed, which is why he's made the next statement. Is anything too difficult for the Lord? You know, this is one of the greatest rhetorical questions in all of the Bible. God is saying to us, is anything too hard for me? Is anything too wonderful for me to do? Is anything too difficult for me? Listen, I don't know what you're facing. I know that most of us are facing some pretty severe trials right now. Maybe financial, family, work, spiritual struggles, sin in your life, health issues, whatever it may be. Listen, I know this. Nothing is too difficult for the Lord. Nothing. Nothing is impossible for him. And that's where faith comes in. Listen, by God's grace, Sarah learned that God could be trusted. Soon she was going to find out that she really was with child and that she would bear a son. You'll find that in chapter 21. And the Lord looked at Sarah and it says the Lord took note of Sarah as he had said, and he did for Sarah what he had promised. That's in chapter 21, verse 1. And you know what? Sarah would laugh again. But the second time she laughed, you find that in chapter 21, verses 5 to 7. This is what God tells us. Abraham was 100 years old, and when his son Isaac was born to him, Sarah said, God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me. He brings laughter to Sarah again, a laughter of unbridled joy, a laughter of delirious wonder at the God who is able to do the impossible. Listen, here's the bottom line. We have a friend for whom nothing is too difficult to do for us. He loves us. And what he calls us to do is to intimate fellowship with him, to be his friend, and to trust him, because he is a friend who sticks closer than a brother. And there is no greater love that a friend can show than what Jesus has shown us. He laid down his life for us.